College football nerds here talking Texas, Oklahoma, Red River showdown, shout out, shootout, rivalry, whatever Fox wants to call it. That's what we're talking about. We miss the old days when the names could be a little unsavory and it was okay. I got Josh with me. We're going to talk model first. We're going to go model straight into it and discuss some things. Going to remind you, collegefootballnerds.com. You can check out that model for free. Pick any two teams you like to run a simulation. It did really well last week. Was the first week that we sort of sprung it on the world, and it went 62% against the spread. Picked things like Florida getting blown out by Kentucky. It said Auburn would play within one score of Georgia. It was 7-0 against for SEC teams, interestingly enough. And this game is interesting. The model's going to be interesting. The discussion points are going to be interesting, partly because this is a really hard game to pick. And this is kind of when I want to go straight into the model, because these two teams have not looked great at times against lesser competition. But there's also maybe some numbers hidden in there that they're performing consistently well relative to competition that might be hidden when you don't really look at relative to performance, which is what our model does. But Josh, why don't you just kick us into the model, because that will give us some discussion points and maybe drive who we want to pick for this game, because I'm not sure I know yet.
Right. So we've got our model, which you can go to collegefootballnerds.com and go and pick any team you want to do and play around with it. And it has Oklahoma 35 and Texas 29.4 in the model. There's a lot of things that go into it. One of the big ones is something we call relative performance. And if you follow our channel, you've heard about this before. Used to call it percent of opponent averages, which was a mouthful and a lot of abbreviations to put on a page. But basically, if your opponent's averaging 4 yards a carry and you held them to 2 yards a carry, you held them to half their average, or in that case, minus 50% compared to their averages. If your opponent is giving up 8 yards per pass attempt and you got 10 yards per attempt in the game, you were plus 20% versus their average. And so what we're doing for our relative performance statistics, and you can go and look at team stats. All the team stats are free. The model's also free. We just ask that you sign up with your on the website, but it's completely free. You can see like your plus 20% or minus 10% or what have you in all those stats, and that's just compared to your schedule and looking at each team on your schedule, how everybody else did against them compared to how you did. You were 20% better or 30% worse than everyone else had done against all your teams, adjusted completely and only for your schedule. And in this regard, it has this being a really tight game. 5.63 yards per play for Oklahoma, 5.67 yards per play from Texas. So we're already down to hundredths of a yard, so you know this is a pretty tight matchup. Oklahoma has a little bit of an edge, throwing an 8.7 yards per attempt to 7.76 for Texas. Running, Texas has the advantage, 3.99 yards, basically 4 yards per carry to 3 yards per carry. The interesting thing there is there's something called a consistency score. It's a little technical, so it took us a while to even consider whether we wanted to include it, but essentially what it's telling you is when the model looks at past results, how much does the model, because it self-trains on how it wants to score and evaluate the teams, how well does the self-trained version from the model actually square with your prior results? And there's a couple different ways it can formulate the model, and it's actually picking a version based off of best fit. And the score is pretty high for Texas. It feels pretty confident that the way it's got Texas figured out maps really cleanly to prior games. Oklahoma's not, and we'll talk about that in a minute. 79 is not a particularly high score. It's actually one of the lower scores that's out there, which indicates the fact that Oklahoma's performances, more than anything, just haven't been consistent. The model can't figure out one way to look at Oklahoma that actually applies to each game. Some games that they've responded in some ways to things, and other games with the same statistical profile, they'd score at a different level, for example. And then the big thing to look at is unit for unit rankings. So if you take Texas, for example, and you put them in against Oklahoma, it'll tell you Texas has a 25% advantage when running the ball. They have a 24% disadvantage, or they have a 5% advantage stopping the run from Oklahoma, I should say. They have a 24% disadvantage when Oklahoma is throwing the ball. When Texas is running the ball, they have a 2% advantage. And when Texas is throwing the football, they're at a 14% advantage. So Texas has the advantage in 3 of the 4 areas, but the big one they don't is often the most impactful part of the game. and that's throwing, where Oklahoma has about a 25% advantage over Texas.
And the consistency score is important because Oklahoma has been a unit all year in our model. We secretly look at this after like the first week, and it's been really high on Oklahoma. What is really interesting to me, though, is that rushing number. It's projecting Oklahoma to get 2.98 yards per carry, and that's because they're a sub 4 yard per carry team this year. And that, to me, is a concern if I'm an Oklahoma fan because they've not played great teams. Their opening schedule, and again, I want to remind everybody because there's going to be some Texas fans in here and there's going to be some other fans in here that say, well, they backed out of the game with Georgia or whatever. That was not the case. Georgia and Oklahoma were ready to play that game. SEC made them cancel it because they could not finish the home and home, both turns of that, before Oklahoma went to the SEC. Texas and Alabama could finish before they went to the SEC. So all of the weird TV contract stuff that has to get negotiated ahead of time for home and homes because the TV rights go with the home conference, all of that got broken when the SEC said Oklahoma and Texas come our way. So that's why they have such a terrible opening slate. And they really have, Josh. It's been really bad. But, they ran it up on Tulsa, and Arkansas State didn't really run it up on Iowa State. I think it was like 40-20 at the half, and they kind of really took the air out of the ball in the second half. But that Cincinnati game, Josh, that SMU game, those are two games where Oklahoma had to perform late to secure those wins. And Texas has not looked great like against Wyoming and in some other games. But I would argue that the numbers that Oklahoma put up in those games, the SMU and Cincinnati games, actually fit with the results. Whereas if you look at, especially in the Kansas game, Texas had something like 9 yards per play. It was something absurd. It was actually, they outperformed that 40 points. And that's why I'm kind of leaning Texas. How much are you concerned with SMU and Cincinnati? And how much, if you're concerned, how much more concerned are you that it's two and not just a one-off?
A little bit. And there's an interesting point here on a lot of levels. They threw the ball pretty consistently well, even in those games. Against Cincinnati, Dillon Gabriel threw for 8.5 yards per attempt. Threw for over 300 yards. Marcus Major did have over 4 yards a carry. It's not like they weren't moving the ball. The biggest thing is, and this is a problem with Dillon Gabriel in general, I think, is that you kind of live and die off him. And sometimes when he scrambles or takes sacks, it can kind of throw off the offense. And that's a little bit what happened in that Cincinnati game. You don't ever want to see double digits, I think, too often next to your quarterback if he's at 2 yards a carry. Even though he did run in a touchdown. Just because it draws too much, kind of siphons off from the rest of the offenses. I often say the quarterback should only run the ball if he has a higher per carry average than the backs, right? The running backs, because the whole point is the quarterback should be someone where when he gets the ball and when he runs it, he burns you. And then the defense is having to account for him, which makes all the running backs more successful. If the defense is glad that the quarterback has kept it, then you're just burning a play. The big thing that I'll say also from Oklahoma in that game, though, is that they gave up 5.7 yards per attempt. Emory Jones had 42 yards rushing on 15 carries. They've played really good defense. And some of these offenses are good. I mean, Cincinnati does have a good defense. And you look at their offensive ranks, right? They're 11th in the country in passing yards per attempt, 75th in yards per carry. But again, when you compare them to the quality of their opponents in our relative performance stat, they're 6th in passing yards per attempt and 66th in yards per carry. Not a great running team, but mid-60s mean you're dead average nationally in college football. But a very, very good passing offense. But when you pair it with the fact, and I think this is the more interesting part to me, their defensive side, the offenses they've played, by and large, have been pretty competent. Maybe not Emory Jones, but by and large, like SMU and whatnot, I mean, they have good, solid offenses. And all of our ranks are actually higher on the relative performance side, by and large, than they are their overall units. Like they're a 20th to 40th best unit but you adjust for opponent averages, and they're 15th in the country in yard per attempt defense, and they're 27th in yard per carry defense. Those are solid numbers. And, even when you look at Texas, as good as their defense has been, they're 16th in yard per attempt, and they're 17th in yard per carry. So actually, it has Oklahoma's pass defense is almost dead equal. Texas has slightly better run defense, but that does kind of, I think, speak to the fact that the model sees Oklahoma as a great team. And I'll tell you, in the model, kind of behind the scenes, we're working on a power rating off our modeling system, and it has Oklahoma 3rd in the country, and it has Texas 10th. It has Oklahoma rated higher. And it's been ultra high in Oklahoma all around. And I'll say, like you look at like F+, which is a combination of SP+ and FEI, there's 2 top 10 teams you got in Texas and Oklahoma, and you don't have another Big 12 team in the top 25. I mean, these guys are far and away the best 2 teams in the Big 12, and it shows up here. But it also makes it difficult to evaluate because they are so much better than everyone else in the Big 12, even outside the out-of-conference schedule. And really only that Alabama-Texas data point sticks out like a sore thumb as the one truly great game or great team either one of them has been able to play. So much of the public opinion, I think, is hinged on the fact that Texas beat a really good team and Oklahoma hasn't had the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, and that's where it pains me that we as collectively as a college football fandom lost that Oklahoma-Georgia game, not just to see and experience the game, but what a valuable data point that would have been. And Oklahoma and Georgia fans and players and staff would say, we wanted that game too. We are so starved for good cross-connecting data points that give context to the full landscape of college football that when you miss out on something like that, a couple of years ago, looking at that game, you think, oh, it's going to be a Georgia blowout. But now I'm not so sure that Oklahoma wouldn't be favored on a neutral field right now against Georgia. But
to be honest, I'd pick Oklahoma to beat Georgia. They've been higher rated by a good bit in our system since we started running it. And I think Oklahoma would have beaten Georgia if they played at this point in the year.
And Georgia hasn't looked great. So Texas is favored by 5.5 in this game. So it's we're struggling with who to pick in this game. Vegas is given a pretty healthy number there. Talk about that relative to what our model's thinking.
Yeah, I mean there's always also this aspect with Vegas of what are they trying to do. People talk about them trying to put even money on both sides, which is usually what they're doing because if there's a certain amount of juice, right? They get a percentage of the winnings for the side that wins. It's why I don't personally bet on games. Our model was 62% against the spread in opening week, which is crazy, not sustainable. And I would say it's not sustainable because the reason Daniel got me started in this, I talked about in another video, is I won a big national pick'em, picking 30 games a week. Several hundred people did the entire season, and I was at 62%. It's really hard to be much better than 50%. Most of the lines are really just set almost exactly where the teams are, and it's just luck whether or not a team covers. Because if the spread is exactly right, then by definition it's just luck. You're never going to be 70%, even though the average gambler apparently thinks that's what they hit. It's not true. Sometimes, though, Vegas tries to make money. I mean, sometimes they see an inefficiency in the market where they know they can goad the public into taking points for one team or another. A couple of years ago, I was on the radio with Sports Illustrated, the Sports Illustrated Georgia site with Josh Pate before the Georgia-Alabama SEC title game. And I had picked Georgia to beat Alabama in that game, and I ended up saying on air I was regretting it because the line was too low. Georgia was only favored by like 1.5 or a couple points. All the money had gone to Georgia, and I made the point that when that happens, Vegas doesn't want to pay out to 80% of the bettors. So if the public is all on one side, if you're going to bet the game, bet the other, because it is almost always the other side that wins. At least against the spread. And the same thing happened, I would say, in the Florida State Clemson game, interestingly, which Vegas was absolutely right on, except it went to overtime, and the way overtime played out, Florida State ended up covering. I'm still bitter about that because I was on the Clemson side. I don't know where this spread is. There's a part of me that feels like the public is so high on Texas that maybe they're going into it. But I also think I think people may be savvy to the fact that Oklahoma's a really good team. And the 5.5 number may just be a reasonable number for Vegas trying to balance the money on either side. Setting at the spread where they think the game is likely to turn up. I will go ahead and switch into my prediction here. I actually have Oklahoma. I have Oklahoma 34-31. I do think this is a close game. And look, if you're picking a team to win by 3 or 4, all I can really do is sort of project and talk about what the teams are and where I think the matchups are. We haven't done that as much. We've talked about the numbers. In short, I think it really comes down to Ewers' ability to consistently hit the deep ball. He did it in the Alabama game. He has not shown it in the other games. That's not something you just flip on and off. I think to some degree, quite frankly, Texas got a little lucky that they caught the right version of Ewers and he was focused. But even being focused, you can miss those throws. They happened to hit on a couple that they really needed to hit in that game. And if they go 0 for 3 on those big plays, and I think they went 1 of 3, they probably lose. And I think against this Oklahoma offense, which is a lot better right now than Alabama is, they're going to put up more points than Alabama did, and they're going to get in the 30s. And I don't think Ewers still has the consistency to really win a shootout versus what is an actual good defense versus the complete garbage atrocity that Oklahoma rolled out last year. So it won't shock me at all if either team wins. Picking a team by 3 means I really don't have much confidence in who wins. But that's the kind of game it is. That's what I think the game's going to hinge on. I think you kind of know what you're going to get out of Gabriel, which is good, not elite, but enough to score a good amount of points. Going to be a physical ball game and still very much a game where Texas can, and to my mind, very much will make a statement if they're able to blow Oklahoma out.
I've got Texas winning 27-23. For me, I struggle with this pick, especially with the Sanders injury. I don't know if we've heard that he's going to play or not, but it's an ankle, which tells me he's not going to be as effective as he otherwise would be, and he's a huge part of the offense. But I also think that I cannot look past the 2 mediocre performances against bad teams. And I don't think, SMU and Cincinnati, if they're playing like G5 teams, they're not a bad team. But when we're talking about competition relative to top 10 teams, they're bad teams. And you should smoke those teams. And I reserve the right to change my opinion about Oklahoma with new data. And I will change my opinion. I evaluate a lot over time that way, and we're really consistent about that. But at this point, I have 5 tomato cans where Oklahoma has struggled well into the fourth quarter with 40% of them. And I cannot look past that, knowing that Texas has gone on the road, won a fourth quarter game against an elite, maybe the best defense in the country. So where I agree with you that Oklahoma is a far better offense than the Alabama offense that Texas saw, Alabama offense that it is now. But even with the good defensive numbers and the much improved Oklahoma defense, I don't think they're nearly as good as Alabama. And that's not a slight to Oklahoma. I think Alabama's got a crappy offense and the best defense in the country. And so I could see Oklahoma scoring more, but I also think that in that case, if they needed to, Texas would also score more because that was 16-13 in the fourth quarter, and I don't think that's going to happen in this game. I've got 27-23 Texas. Obviously, like you, that's a coin flip. Neither one of us have Texas covering the Vegas number. Josh, before we wrap this up, did the Sanders injury play into your prediction at all, or is this pretty much a kind of overall matchup thing that drove you to Oklahoma?
There's a lot out there that really pans out that one player is never worth more than about 7 points unless it's the starting quarterback. So it's not a huge deal, but if he was healthy, I probably would have picked Texas. He is an important part of that offense. If you look at the big drives they had, like in the Alabama game, it was very often Sanders making a 20 to 30 yard play that kicked it off, got it going, got it in good scoring position. Texas has had issues scoring. At some point, like in the Kansas game, the Alabama game, Stephen Parker from Frogs of War pointed this out. At some point, it is your identity that you're stalling in the red zone. And we've talked about that for years, that in the modern era of RPO football, it's a lot harder to score in the red zone if you're an RPO-based offense or it's a big part of your offense. And so, it's not just a coincidence anymore. A lot of teams with a really good coordinator like Sark are really good at moving the ball between the 20s. And then those advantages from scheme kind of disappear, and then you start to see who the offense is. And so I think stalling in the red zone is going to be a continual issue, and without Sanders, it's going to be that much harder. So yeah, it was a big factor. And the other thing I wanted to touch on, though, is I do think Texas is also kind of a little bit underrated in the model. So if it wasn't for the Sanders injury, I probably would have picked them because Baylor and Alabama are two of their data points, and both those teams had games where they didn't play their starting quarterback. Alabama willingly, Baylor unwillingly. And this is also relational, that Texas looks worse in our modeling system because Alabama and Baylor look worse because of those games. And no, it doesn't filter out for injuries because, one, there's not enough games to do that and have anything to spit out. And two, it's virtually impossible to code that in a way that's smart enough to know who was the guy that was back replaced versus, due to injury or whatever, unless you just stick your hand in and mess with things, which we don't do. And let me point out, the whole point of our model is not really to predict the outcome in many ways. We often say it's based solely on this year's data, and we do it to predict trends. And that's why it did so well against the spread. Even though the mean error was a little further than Vegas, it beat Vegas substantially in terms of picking against the spread. Vegas did better in terms of mean error for results. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. It is a lot on the Sanders injury. And I do think Texas in many ways is kind of underrated. These are just two top 10, if not top 5 teams, really.
And a lot of people will point out that Texas, they're going to say they got lucky because Daniels was out for Kansas. I don't think so, because Texas put up 660 yards, 86 plays they ran, 7.7 yards per play, which was the number I was looking for earlier. They had a running back go for 200 yards, 10 yards a carry on 21 carries. That's insane. Like, for a running back to hit 10 yards a carry, usually they ran it 3 times and one of them was a 60-yarder. So when you touch it 21 times like Brooks did and go 10-40, that's nuts. Ewers 9.3 yards per attempt. So they were going to put up 60 if they needed to on Kansas regardless. Now, to Oklahoma's credit, they've done the same against other teams. I just wanted to throw that out there for people that say, well, Texas only blew out Kansas because Daniels was hurt. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think Kansas would have scored more, but Texas would have named the number they wanted on offense. All right, anything else on this one, Josh?
Nope. I think we've gone long enough.
All right, thanks so much, y'all, for hanging.
Like and subscribe, guys. Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. Helps us out a lot. I will say, before we go to our exit, the Alabama-Texas video got us the most subscribers of any one video we've ever done in 5 years. We're closing in on 40,000 subscribers. We've had some good viewed videos. That one got us more subscribers from that one video, and I think it was mostly Texas fans. So y'all keep it going. Share this on your home message board or where you talk sports. Would help us out a lot. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.